We begin, though, with a deal years in the making, secured this morning in Montreal.
I do not see objection. The package is adopted.
The COP15 Biodiversity Summit has ended with an agreement between 195 nations. By the year 2030, they'll place 30% of land and sea under protection. It comes amid warnings from scientists that the planet is seeing the largest loss of plant and animal species since dinosaurs went extinct. Stephen Guilbeault is the Minister of Environment. He's in Montreal. Minister Guilbeault, you described this deal as tremendous progress, but it also met with tremendous resistance over financing over the final days of these talks. How did this deal finally come together?
I would beg to differ on your characterization of the level of support. The agreement received massive amount of support, almost unanimity, with the exception of 3 countries out of 196. That's strong support for me, but I'll agree that there was some disagreement in the room.
Right. Well, that's what I wanted to talk about. I don't mean the end. I mean, there are 70 countries, primarily from Africa, Asia, and South America, who are concerned about the way the money would be brought into this deal. And so how were you able to overcome those objections from nations primarily in the global South?
First, by listening to their concern, and I've had numerous meetings with representatives from the South, and in many of my interviews, and I wasn't the only one doing that. The United Kingdom, the European Union, and others were saying, "You're being heard. We're hearing what you're telling us. We want to work with you to improve access to funds through either bilateral agreements or through UN mechanisms like the Global Environmental Fund, for example, but also that we wanted to do more when it comes to supporting their efforts in nature conservation. So we've committed in this agreement to double by 2025 and triple by 2030 the amount of support that was available in the previous decade. So I think by doing all these things, we were able to show them that we were serious and that we were sincere in our efforts to work with them.
Right. So despite getting the bulk of those 70 countries on side, as you said, there were 3 outliers at the end, and even Congo, at the time when the final gavel was struck down declaring this agreed, was voicing objections. So what more work do you need to do with countries like Congo and Uganda to reassure them that their concerns will be satisfied, even though COP is coming to an end?
That's a good question, David. And in fact, even in the middle of the night last night, I was talking to colleagues from the United Kingdom, the United States, France, to see how we can work together and reach out to these countries and start working with them, building bridges. So again, to show our sincerity, like it's not just about getting a deal on paper. It's not just for media. We are collectively committed to working with them. And I think reaching out the way we did was one of the ways. Obviously, it's the beginning of something. It's not the end, but I think we will be able to get there.
So I want to talk about the numbers if I can. You talk about doubling by 2025 and tripling by 2030. And I just want to check some of the math here. My understanding is you've got a target now of $200 billion to help with biodiversity. Is that the right amount of money from public and private sources?
So that's correct. So that from all sources, including private sector, including multilateral institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. So that's the $200 billion goal, but that's as of 2030.
Right.
So what we've also committed in the meantime is by 2025 providing 20 billions of support for these countries, which is a doubling from the previous decade, from 2010 to 2020. And from 2025 to 2030, we're saying we're going to bring that up to $30 billion. So it's a staged approach to getting to the goal by 2030 of being able to provide $200 billion worth of support for developing countries as well as domestic implementation.
Right, and look, $200 billion is a lot of money, but there was been some recent reports that say we need to actually spend about $700 billion to address biodiversity loss. So is this enough? As significant as this is this enough, or do you need to look for other agreements or increases in that period of time to try to solve this significant problem?
Well, the $200 billion is basically 700 minus 500. And what's the 500? It's harmful subsidies. Subsidies in countries around the world that are harmful to nature. And the commitment we've made here, which is very similar to the commitment we've made on climate change. On climate change, we said we have to eliminate subsidies to fossil fuels. And Canada last week announced that we were putting an end to international fossil fuel subsidies. We're only the 8th country in the world to do that. And we've committed that by the middle of next year, we will put an end to fossil fuel subsidies in Canada. We basically need to do the same thing for subsidies that are harmful to nature. And these are estimated to be about $500 billion. We need to take those and repurpose them. And that's exactly what we're doing on climate change in Canada. We're eliminating fossil fuel subsidies and ramping up investment in transit, in electrification, in clean technologies. So we need to do that for nature.
Okay, so it's a combination of new spending and new pledges, plus the ending of subsidies that are harmful or a reprofiling of those subsidies, and that's how you get to the $700 billion. Okay, so you've committed to do this at the federal level. There are provinces in this country that do have their own version of subsidies for things like the oil sector. Will you work with them? Can you work with them to have those eliminated by 2030, or do you have to compensate for those through other means?
We will work with them. We are working with them. And David, I got a number of text messages today from provincial colleagues congratulating me on landing this agreement. And they're not from provinces that most people would expect. I won't name names. In respect
well, that's
of
Alberta and Saskatchewan. I mean, obviously, Minister, right?
It was more than 2 provinces.
Newfoundland and Labrador.
But what I'm saying is that on these issues, sometimes there's more support and there's more room to work together than one might think.
Right. So part of this, though, is to set aside 30% of land and 30% of water to be protected areas, that there can be no significant development in those areas. Right now, as I understand it, Canada's at about 13.5% of land mass protected and 14% of water protected. So you need to double, more or less, both of those by 2030. Yeah. So how do you work with provinces, for example, who might object to that because of economic opportunities and development opportunities that exist in these particular areas? Because there could be offshore oil, there could be fishing grounds, there could be critical minerals in these areas. How do you balance that?
Well, by talking together, by working together. Last week with the Prime Minister, we announced 4 Indigenous-led conservation initiatives in British Columbia, in the Northwest Territories, in Nunavut, in Ontario. And these projects for land represent more than 1 million square kilometer. So in the last week and a half, we've announced that we would protect the equivalent of half of Belgium in the last 10 days. And we know we need to do more, but with these announcements and with those partnerships, we know we're on track to meeting our target, our interim target of protecting 25% of lands and oceans by 2025, on our way to protecting 30% in 2030. The other way we're doing this is by signing nature agreements with provinces and territories. And we announced the first one here with Yukon, where the federal government will support conservation initiatives by the government of Yukon, by Yukon First Nations, to the tune of several tens of millions of dollars, in the Yukon. And we're working with a number of other provinces and other jurisdictions to make similar announcements in the coming months.
But 30% of Canadian landmass is, as I understand it, roughly the size of the European Union, right? That is a pretty big chunk of geography. Yeah. But how do you balance that with things like the critical mineral strategy we saw from Minister Wilkinson? Because some of these hard-to-find minerals could be in some of these hard-to-reach places that you may want to protect. So how do you balance this if these two come into conflict over the next decade or so?
That's a very good question. And I think the key word in what you just said is balance. So we will work with provinces, we will work with Indigenous people to find the right balance. So it may be the case that there's a great deposit of a certain mineral, but because it's in a sensitive area or culturally very significant area for First Nations, we'll decide not to go there. But in collaboration with them, we will agree that we can go in other parts of their territories to mine for lithium or other critical minerals we need to do the transition. So I think it's a new way of doing things in Canada. It's a way where, it's not just up to government and companies to decide how things are done, but you need to work with Indigenous people and local communities to ensure that things are done properly.
Could land swaps be on the table? If you find something in a protected area, swap that for another area? I mean, is this the sort of thinking you could look at here, given how important these minerals will be for the economic future of the country?
Again, in collaboration with Indigenous people, with provinces and territories, but these are certainly solutions that are on the table. In fact, some mining companies in Canada are doing that. For 1 hectare of land that they'll affect because of mining, they'll protect 3 more hectares somewhere else. And we're seeing some of these innovative solutions appear all around the world. This is certainly amongst a menu of options we have to do things in a different way.
Okay, Minister Guilbeault, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, David.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.